Okay, so thank you again for letting me interview you in regards to how classical music in this case
Hmm.
has changed over time in Bristol from the 50s. So first question is pretty much introducing yourself, who you are, very minimum, what's your profession slash title, and if how long you've been playing and composing music for.
Okay, so essentially, I'm a performer rather than a composer, and I studied music at university. I've been in Bristol now for a few years, not living there but working there at the University of West of England for the Centre for Music. My title there is Senior Lecturer of Classical and Jazz Music Enrichment, which is a very long title, which basically means I look after anything that is classical and jazz that happens at the university, whether that's rehearsals or concerts and events or master classes or visiting artists. So I look after that side of it for our classical and jazz musicians. I do that part-time, 50% of the week. And for the other 50%, I'm either conducting in community groups and orchestras and brass bands and wind bands, or playing the trombone professionally, either in this country and also abroad as well. So that is my work. That's what I do.
Nice. So what kind of genre are you most specialized in? What would you say?
Okay. I'm going to steer away from the term classical. I'm going to say formal,
Formal.
formally educated in classical music. And that's quite important because educationally, there are a couple of different titles we give, generic titles to the way people are taught, either informally, which could be people who just pick up a guitar and play it and learn it in the bedroom without any formal training. Um, Non-formally, which could be going to a community music group and learning with somebody in a formal way, having a lesson, learning how to read music, but not necessarily by somebody who's had any formal qualifications in teaching. So it's more of a kind of a non-formal approach to a formal lesson by somebody who is not necessarily qualified in any way. Not that makes them any worse or any better than anybody else. And then formally, where you might go to an institution to have your lessons. So I went to a university to study music, classical music, but a lot of my work is working with community musicians and community music groups as well. So I am classically trained, I enjoy jazz, and I work in formal and non-formal settings.
Okay. This question is based on your experience in, well, not classical music, but formal classical music
Yeah.
and just music in general, I guess. Would you also include jazz, or because considering that
Oh,
you, okay,
sure, absolutely.
do you believe there is a growth in interaction with those types of music in jazz, in formal classical music, yeah, and such like that?
And I think if we talk about Bristol, we talk about many cities are in in similar circumstances. Has there been a growth? It's very difficult to know if there's been a growth because a lot of activity goes unseen, and a lot of activity tends to be down to one or two key people. So let me give you a really good example. There is an orchestra in Bristol called the Resonance Orchestra, and it brings together musicians from all across Bristol to do very large orchestral works who would not normally have the opportunity to play because they are so large, they require so many people, and it's really driven by just one individual. And without that individual pushing it, that orchestra would not happen. So first thing you have to understand, I think, is that the amount of activity in a city tends to come down to the amount of those strong individuals and organizations you have. Just because there might be a large range of orchestras, so Bristol has the Resonance Orchestra, it has the Bristol Metropolitan Orchestra, it has the Bristol Symphony Orchestra, the Bristol Chamber Orchestra, and so on and so on and so on. And these titles, whilst they're all individual and they all have their own organizations, the crossover of players between those groups can be quite strong. So you might find that you have the same violinists in many ensembles. You might find that somebody gets disgruntled by one group and therefore sets another one up. So whilst you can look and say that Bristol might have quite a depth of orchestras, it doesn't mean that those players are individually to those specific ensembles. They may be crossed over. There may be a small group of players who just call themselves an orchestra. So that's the first part to understand. It would be quite difficult to know exactly how many people are actually engaging on a weekly basis. The second part of that is and I'm going to kind of refer to this quite a lot, I think, in the interview, is Bristol as a gateway to the southwest. So Bristol is our major city in the southwest of England. It is the gateway to the southwest. You have to almost physically drive through it or around it to get anywhere to somewhere with a beach at the end of our country. But it's also the last place that you get to before you leave the southwest of notable size, if you like, unless you kind of include Gloucester or Cheltenham. And because of that, you would think that Bristol would be the place where your professional ensembles would be. And there is a small Bristol, the Bristol Players, I think they're called, I might be wrong, a small group of professional players. They're definitely not full-time, but they are paid. But Bristol does not have those key ensembles, which I'm kind of come on to in a moment. Now, Birmingham does, Manchester does, and Cardiff has these as well. So if we take Cardiff for an example, Cardiff has a professional orchestra and it has a professional opera company, the Welsh National Opera, based in Cardiff. And because you have professional players, and let's assume the two orchestras mean we have about 150 professional players in Cardiff City, fully employed in classical playing. Underneath them, you therefore have a line of freelancers who occasionally get work with those orchestras. So freelance musicians hang around and make their home in the city where they know they can get some work. And underneath those freelancers will be another tier of musicians, the kind of the semi-professionals who play a bit professionally now and again, but maybe earn their income from other streams like teaching. So there's much more of a depth of different musicians of different qualities. And that makes the whole classical and jazz scene really buzz. In Bristol, we don't have that. So one really important difference with Bristol is we don't tend to have that same level of professional players in their numbers, which are based, unlike Cardiff or Birmingham, Manchester, even Bournemouth, which has their own professional orchestra. So those are the two areas I would say it's quite unique with Bristol.
You mentioned there was a type of orchestra that Bristol doesn't have.
Basically, a professional orchestra,
okay,
a full-time orchestra with paid players. We don't have that in Bristol, and we don't have an opera company, a ballet company, a professional big band. Whereas if you went to Birmingham, you'll find they have Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. If you went to Cardiff, you have the BBC National Orchestra of Wales and Welsh National Opera. So you have those quality institutions which are based there full-time in that city. And that makes that a much richer environment.
Okay, that's fair. That's actually the first time someone's mentioned like how Bristol isn't it's not really the case that Bristol is 100% rich with classical and jazz, which makes sense considering that when doing this assignment, what I've come to learn is that with Bristol's music scene, it's not only the main reason why it was considered such a musical city during a decade ago, according to the Performance Rights Society, was from the past, was from the situations that happened in the past, such as the Bristol Sound, such as the use of the Bristol Beacon and other places. However, nowadays it's a lot more different. There are other cities that kind of keep the reputation of classical and jazz for UK and such, and Bristol anymore. So yeah, that's quite interesting to think of. Talking about this is kind of linked to the Bristol Beacon and such. Do you believe that places such as the Bristol Beacon, the Lantern, St. George, well, you mentioned that classical isn't incredibly prominent here, but do you believe that it could be helping classical stay relevant in Bristol?
Absolutely. There's when I say the music isn't happening, I mean that classical music isn't happening at a professional level.
Okay.
Because we don't have those organizations here. Now, classical music, for want of a better term, which requires a large space just for your performers, which requires a large amount of audience to come to make the gig financially worthwhile. Imagine paying 75 full-time musicians £150 for the day. Immediately you're up to 16, 17,000 pounds just to put the bums on the seats for one concert. So if you can kind of get that into your mind, if we took the musicians union rate of £156 and then you've got travel on top of that, so let's say you're paying £200 per musician for a day for a rehearsal and a concert, and there's 75 of them in a full symphony orchestra, then that's £15,000 that you have to shell out before you open the door just to get the orchestra with their bums on the seats on the stage.
Wow.
So
wow.
It's not a cheap place. So you really, as a fixer, want to make sure that the venue that you're booking, which also might cost you a couple of grand a day, is going to be big enough that if you sell 500 tickets at 50 quid each, then you're going to get your money back. So you really do want to make sure that you have those venues in places. Now, that means that not necessarily it works on two levels. It means that local amateur orchestras and choirs of suitable size have got really good places to perform. The difference with amateurs, we know, will be that they don't get paid. So let's take a really good example. Let's take the Bristol Sing Out Choir, which is an LGBT plus choir, open to anybody, but fundamentally their members are LGBT plus or ally. And I mention them because they are 70 strong. So there's a good 70 to 80 members every week that turn up. Now they book out St. George's once a year for 2 nights. I think St. George's holds 400 people, and they sell out St. George's for 2 nights. Can't get a ticket. It's really popular because they do all the big show tunes, and it's great fun. There's lots of glitz and glamour, and I think the strength of the LGBT plus community in Bristol means that a lot of people will come and support them, and they want to come and have a fun evening in music. And that choir, with that amount of support, need a venue like St. George's, which is big enough to hold a concert that they can sell to 400 people. So at an amateur level, we need places which are good, that size to perform. But the important thing here is to then differentiate between those people who visit Bristol. So the Colston Hall, now the Beacon Hall, or the Beacon, is a very important venue, because if it wasn't for venues like that, then the Bristol Jazz and Blues Festival would not be able to attract big jazz and blues stars from around the world. So if you take somebody like Arturo Sandoval, who's a Cuban trumpet player, who's a massive name globally well-known, probably one of the top 5 trumpet players in the world, performed in Bristol about 80 years ago, would not have come to Bristol, I think, if that venue did not mean that they could sell a good substantial amount of tickets to cover his fee and his band's fee, which would have been quite substantial. So from a fixing point of view, from a large name point of view, these venues are really, really important. So I'll give you a parallel here, if you like. When you see the large tours of comedians going around the country, they're often, almost always, they are part of a fixer who fixes the whole tour. And the magic number for any venue is 1,000. They won't play anything underneath 1,000 because it's not financially worthwhile. They won't get the money back. So Cheltenham Town Hall, I think, is something like 800 and something. So that limits them. Whereas the Beacon is way over 1,000. So you're going to get the big names coming that you wouldn't otherwise have got because their fees would have been too big. So those are really important for 2 things. To summarize, for amateur groups to have a large place to perform for their local family and friends and supporters, and so that Bristol benefits from the big names being able to come into their city, so Bristolians have the opportunity to see them on their home turf.
When you were mentioning about the LGBT choir and that band, it helps me come to like a realization, because like also this was also with my previous interview, that with the help of venues such like big venues such as the Bristol Beacon, heck, even smaller venues such as like small bars and such like that, it kind of brings more cultures in together. So for example, with again back in with the LGBT, with the whole change of like culture, like something that didn't happen, like something that didn't happen in like 40 years ago is like so normal now, and like people will happily sell out tickets just to see groups like that. And in like small places, like I remember a couple of years ago I went to a bar and they were doing Afro jazz, and it was the whole bar was booked out completely. People were enjoying it. I think thanks to the help of venues, classical music and jazz, it's still thriving in some sort, in a way that are still being able to like happily go over and be like, oh yeah, Bristol is a good place for classical and jazz, though it's not like highest like in professional wise. It's a place where people can just go and visit venues such as the Lantern, Bristol Beacon, especially with Bristol Beacon with the huge and with the huge players coming in, but like small players booking out those studios, booking out bars, booking out small venues and such like that, which is quite nice to think about. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think even on a jazz footing, I mean, if you can go from anything from playing at St George's to all the way down to playing at the Old Duke down by the river, which is Bristol's very old and famous jazz bar, and it's got a phenomenal reputation across the country. Any jazz musician who's been to Bristol will just say, oh yeah, I played at the Old Duke. And it's thriving, absolutely thriving. University jazz band played down there last February, just before the lockdown, and we couldn't move. It was absolutely heaving. So there's all these tiny little venues all over the place. They're almost endless, really, that keep that scene definitely thriving.
It's quite important to like consider all the smaller venues, because Bristol is quite has quite a lot of historical places that has now become so prominent with certain types of genres, with certain types of bands and such like that, which is quite nice to think of. So yeah, we've kind of had a talk, well, it's kind of linked with the previous questions, but the next question is, what kind of future do you see for classical and jazz? Do you see it carrying out more, or do you see it kind of like dying down? But considering our last like the previous answers with the venues and such, well, right now I personally don't think it will die down anytime soon due to all the venues. But what do you think?
Again, I think there's it's almost impossible to know. It's almost an impossible question to answer. Is classical music as popular now as it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago? You could very, very simply say, well, it depends what generation, depends how you're viewing it, how you're gathering the details. You can look at audience numbers who go to concerts, the amount of concerts that are being held. It's definitely under the cosh. It's definitely not thriving, because at the moment there are several political and educational factors which have had quite a big impact on classical music in this country. And also culturally as well. And there's some really good examples where you can give this with Venezuela and Cuba, where classical music is sort of being imported, if you like, as Western classical music, and is thriving in all areas of society, but not necessarily in the UK. So I think classical and jazz music has its challenges. Certainly does have its challenges, especially now in a world where music is so accessible. It's so easy to be able to access music and go off at a tangent. One of the nicest things I like to do, especially if I'm home on my own and my husband's away, is I like to have a nice glass of whiskey, put YouTube on or something I enjoy, and then just let it run. And in 2 hours' time, find out what I'm listening to, because it just ends up in the most fantastic areas. And you just end up listening to so much. And you couldn't do that even 20 years ago. That was not possible, just to have this open. I was studying a piece of music yesterday for a conducting lesson. I was having a lesson from a professional conductor. And I just popped YouTube on, and I could see my conducting tutor in action with the Symphony Orchestra of India 8 years ago. And I could watch him in action. And I couldn't do that 20 years ago. So your access to brilliant music, is it thriving in younger people? Yes, but start listening to what younger people are listening to. One of the great exports of the UK in recent years has been a musician called Jacob Collier. I don't know if you've heard of Jacob Collier. Look him up. A lot of young people are following this guy, and he is a jazz genius, one of the top jazz geniuses. I mean, just literally a kind of a child prodigy, if you like. Happens to come from the UK, tours all over the world. And when you see him on YouTube, you will just see he's just insanely talented. And the younger generation are listening to this. This is that next step of jazz music. But he would go into the classical world. He would work with orchestras. He does massive productions and remixes in his own compositions. So I think in that respect, it is thriving, but maybe not in the way that we traditionally, I'm going to use inverted commas now, traditionally the way that we see an orchestra. That has been challenged, and I hope it continues to be challenged because it needs to progress.
No, yeah, I totally agree with you. It kind of links to how, like, obviously this definitely links to how technology and how things have changed over time. Like my last interviewee, she mentioned how, like, before the 2000s, to go to a classical concert, it was very formal because it was in one area. However, nowadays, with the help of the internet, with the help of YouTube, Spotify, it's more informal. So people are listening to classical more. However, it's also due to changes, it's not the traditional way people listen to it as anymore. It's like more integrated. It's more it's various. There's so many different types of like music, different types of classical music. It's at a stage where more people are listening to classical, but at the same time they're also listening to so many other genres that we can't really classify classical as something that's getting more and more popular as of now. But there's so many different types of genres. Like you said, I also enjoy just turn on Spotify and let it go as it is, and I would end up with the completely different genres I never even heard of. But like that's the fun of technology nowadays, and it's not really killing off classical or jazz, but it is introducing more people, as well as showing more integrated versions, more different variations of it, which is quite nice. And I think that's the nice thing about technology, is the fact that like more people are having access to such types of genres and vice versa. So yeah.
There's a really nice story about, in November we had a series of masterclasses at the University of West of England, and one of the masterclasses was with a trumpet player from London called Mike Lovett. Now you would come to the masterclass if one, you were a trumpet player because you would know Mike Lovett because he's a big name. If you were a jazz musician, if you were a classical musician who's listened to the John Wilson Orchestra and the BBC Prom series in London, then you might come along to that masterclass last year because it's Mike Lovett and you're a trumpet player, you're a jazz supporter, or you like all the old movie stuff from the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, and Mike is the trumpet player on there. But the one thing that we got the most hits for on our social media campaign were from students who said, "Oh my word, I can't believe you've got this guy coming. He's the trumpet player from Avengers Assemble films." So our students at university have heard Mike play. They don't know it's Mike, obviously, but they love the films Avengers Assemble. And so people came along because they wanted to meet and listen to the guy who played the trumpet on the Avengers Assemble film. Now, to me, movie music is classical music. It's full scored, massive orchestra stuff that gets done in Abbey Road in the massive studios in London. And they all get recorded. A lot of stuff gets recorded in London because our musicians in the UK are among the best in the world, and they're awesome sight readers. So it's cheaper to record sometimes in London because the job gets done quicker. And all the James Bond films have been recorded in London. The Star Wars films in the 70s were recorded by the London Symphony Orchestra, even though they are American films, filmed in America, recorded in London. So film music to me is one of the great progresses of classical music. You know, it's modern classical music. It's very easy. It's easy to listen to. It's very accessible. It's obviously incredibly programmatic. But a lot of that music will exist just as well in the concert venue without the film behind it. It stands up on its own merits. I think Star Wars is a great example of how that works. So I think we have to embrace it. We have to embrace that and just say, look, this is great music. It really is fantastic music. And a good example of that was we had a workshop at the university last year with the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra members and all of our musicians and community musicians. And we started off with Gustav Holst's The Planets, Mars and Jupiter, very formal classical music from 120 years ago. And then we played a couple of the themes from Star Wars. And we chose those both because they're about planetary experiences and out of this world experiences, but the music actually, the similarities between those two pieces are really, really close. John Williams, the composer, nicked so much from Gustav Holst's music. And when you play them side by side, you can hear it. And so we have to embrace the brilliance of film composers, how that music can be so accessible to the younger generation, and ensure that that's what we program. We program that alongside all the other great music from 400 years.
Yes, that's actually, I didn't know. How did I not know about the trumpet player? Oh, darn it. Okay, that helps me like support the idea that with the help of technology, this kind of links to like culture change, because culture change isn't really something that I know someone from a different country brings in their traditions. It can also vary from how things have changed from someone's daily like routine to like a town, etc. And I like to include the whole change in technology being a whole change in culture, because it's crazy to think that 30 years ago technology as we have now did not even exist. Most of the technology we have now did not even exist. So I would assume this is a change of culture, and especially with the access of this technology. So as you mentioned with Mike Lovett, is that his name? With his music, and because more people have access to movies, especially as it's now like streamed online and such like that, people can be like, oh, this is the person who played in the Avengers, this is really cool, I want to see and learn more about him and about the music he plays and composes. So I think that's pretty interesting to know how technology is playing a huge factor in Bristol music scene as well as the whole like world as well. So yeah, so I kind of answered it, but like I also want your opinion. But based on your opinions, do you think that culture and politics has influenced the way classical music is today? So yeah.
Absolutely it has. The way it's been promoted, the way it's been perceived, the formal nature of classical music and how it was promoted in concert halls have definitely been something which we've really struggled with in the UK. So I'll give you a couple of other examples which might challenge your thinking and might be good for your research project. And I'll pose them as questions really. So why is it in Venezuela they spent millions and millions of pounds on something called the El Sistema project? And it was set up, I imagine about 15, 20 years ago, maybe a little longer, for young people who were homeless. These are kids who had absolutely nothing at all in society. They were homeless, they were on drugs, they were being sold for scrupulous means. They had no parents or family. They were street urchins, kids, and they were taken into a school. And the El Sistema project used classical music as the focus for those children. And the deal was, we will give you a bed to sleep in and food and drink and a warm place and a safe place for you to grow up. We will give you your schooling, and all of you are going to learn to play a musical instrument through formal education. And they had, I think, 4 or 5 lessons a week. Everything was based around classical music, and they produced, by far in my mind, one of the best youth orchestras in the entire world. And they come from kids who are absolutely on their knees with nothing behind them whatsoever, and they turn out to be these brilliant musicians. So they've used classical music as a social engineering project to ensure that these students have a real fighting chance. And they use classical music because it's a great discipline. You find out a huge amount yourself by having to practice 4 or 5 hours a day. It gives you a sense of worth. It gives you that social interaction. It gives you a respect of your elders. All of the things that you want to instill in young people, it's there encapsulated. If you went to Cuba and you went to the ballet, then you will see the ballet being attended by working class people. Whole audiences of just bog standard working class folk going to the ballet just the same as they would go to watch the football. It is not on any different plane of importance or cultural or class importance. And their ballerinas in Cuba, female and male ballerinas in Cuba, are heroes. They're megastars. They are as big as their footballers are. They are seen as, kind of local gods. So in these cultures where we've in the Western culture, or in Western Europe, we invented the ballet and we invented the Western music, been imported into countries like Cuba and Venezuela, and they are just running with it as ways of socially enable people to improve their own lives. And it's not seen as something which is high and mighty. And there's the big deal. The big deal in this country is that maybe, and it's a very difficult thing to admit because I know we do have a degree of problem with poverty and child deprivation, but nothing compared to what you would witness in Venezuela. So we have a system here where students have a certain amount, and so we don't need as much to push classical music or formal music training onto people. And the way that classical music is viewed in this country doesn't have that same grassroots, working class, this is fantastic, you must go and see this ballet dancer and listen to this music, it is tremendous. We don't have that in this country. It's always been quite a class divide. But on the flip side, I would also argue that classical music is not too expensive either. I think that's often something that has been peddled wrongly. You can go and see a classical music concert for a £5 or a £10, not a problem. Even in the Albert Hall, you can get cheap tickets and go and see an orchestra. And I think often we are put off, well, I don't want to go because it's too much money. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's ever been the case. But I don't think it's ever been promoted in a way that wants whole families to go and listen to it. I just don't think we're in that culture in this country, sadly.
Yeah. I guess it's also I'm going to also ask, do you think it's also due to like how, so in Venezuela, how they got those kids to learn classical music formally, and compared to here, how we don't really see classical music as big anymore? Do you also think it's due to how different countries view the level of sophistication with classical music? So I would kind of assume like back home in Nigeria, if I play classical music to some of my family and friends who've been in Nigeria their whole lives, they think this is like incredibly classical, this is incredibly cool, and they want to learn more about it. Like unlike here, where we can hear it pretty much like very minimal case, like you can go to a Catholic church and you can probably hear some sort of classical music for like their Christmas plays or something like that. So it's probably also due to how different countries view how the sophistication, I guess. So in Bristol, I'm going to say UK in general, would you say it's due to like how often we've been exposed to classical music compared to like other countries where we don't really react as much compared to like countries in South America and Africa and such like that. In other words, non-Western countries.
Yeah. It's a really, really difficult thing to try and find out, and there's probably a whole PhD in there in itself. There's quite a disconnect. I mean, some studies you'll find will tell you that, I saw one recently that 74% of teenagers said that music plays a very important thing in their life, a very important part of their life. So if 74% of teenagers are telling you that, why has engagement in studying GCSE and A-level music plummeted in recent years? And in another survey 8 or 9 years ago, music was the least popular subject taught in secondary schools. So why are those two surveys at odds with each other? Is it that young people don't want to be taught formally? Is it that classical music or the curriculum is not reflective of what students want to listen to? Or is it simply that they've not been exposed in a positive way? And I've been fortunate to do quite a bit of research on this. I spent a month in Chicago in 2015. In some areas of Chicago, quite again heavy deprivation and homelessness, schools decided that young people would learn to play a musical instrument. Now, they don't play a musical instrument because they want to teach them classical music. They play them because they know it makes them into a better human being. So by formally training young people in a discipline of some sort, whether that's learning to be a really, really good basketball player, whether it's to be a good violin player or a good dancer, anything which requires formal training and repetitive daily practice is a really good discipline to instill. And in America, they give them 5 lessons a week. They have a music lesson on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. In one high school I went to, some students were studying music 3 hours a day because they wanted to, and their parents would support that. And 94% of American parents, when asked in a survey, said that they valued music as an academic subject. Now, can you imagine 94% of parents in this country being asked the question, do you value music as an academic subject? I think you would get quite a different result. I think parents here would say, well, we enjoy music and we value music. Is it an academic subject? Not quite sure. And currently in the curriculum, it's not. It's a vocational subject, and it's under the vocational branch of Progress 8. So it's not actually an academic subject at all now in schools. So I think we're under a little bit of the terminology in this country would be that music is vocational, something you can do if you wish, but it's not an academic subject. It's not valued the same as geography, history, maths, English. In America, very different case.
I kind of understand how young students don't take music in, especially in GCSE. I did music in GCSE, and personally, for me, I think one reason why I did enjoy it, however, I guess it wasn't really kind of linked. It wasn't how I expected it. So when studying music during the course of year 7 to year 10, really, for the vocational music, it was something that it didn't really portray the music that most kids would like to learn. It was simple classical. We had classical music. We also did have around the world. However, for my school, it wasn't very that wide range. And then for GCSE, they did go through different types of genres. However, even though it went through different types of genres, it didn't go through genres like that most people listen to now. It didn't go into depth about the type of music young students are interested in. The latest type of music that was released that we had to that student had to research in was from Moby, his name Moby, which was like 2001. So that was like the latest type of music. And then we did have others, but like it was around the early 2000s. Meanwhile, like we're already a decade past this type of music, and though it was quite interesting to learn the different types of sounds, it was, I guess most people weren't interested due to the fact that it wasn't going into depth of what kind of music is today. Why do people make sounds like this and such? Yeah, that's kind of like my reason. But yeah, with America, it's quite cool. It's quite interesting to see that, or to know that music is such a compulsory thing in their studies, that they will learn it every day. Meanwhile, in secondary school, at least in my secondary school, we only did it once or twice a week. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see that. I guess it's also due to the same factor of the level of exposure with classical music. Would you say that's the case? Why most parents here would have different answers to why UK parents will think music is not particularly an academic kind of subject to learn compared to American parents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm making quite kind of sweeping statements, because it's definitely not. I mean, America is 51, 52 different countries, so it's. I was in one particular country or state where this was taken quite seriously, and in the schools that I went to, where those students are given the opportunity, the school takes full responsibility of every role. They take the role of educator, of teacher and parent. And so during the time they're in school, they will play their trombone or their clarinet Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And when they go home on weekends, you might practice a bit if you want to, but you know that next Monday you've got your next lesson, you're going to be succeeding. And students really, whatever background they come from, you can't fail, because if you're playing every single day or 5 days a week, then you don't need to go home and do your practice. You don't have to be burdened with that. It's done for you. The school is providing this for you. The parents don't have to do anything. All the parents have to do is rock up to a gig, sit their backsides on a seat and listen to how good their son or daughter is. They have no other responsibility. So, of course, as then when they see the results of the impact that has on their child and their confidence, of course they're going to say, yeah, I think this is really good. But they've had to do very little about it. In our country, there's quite a financial commitment. It's cost money. You've got to take them places. You've got to get the instruments sorted out. In America, that's all done for you. And I think, again, the culture plays a big part. In 2000 and when was it? I think it was 2018, or it might have been 19. I spent 10 days in South Korea working on a music festival over there, and I listened to 80 groups over 5 days. It was quite adjudicating. It was quite intense, and they were all school kids, so kids from our primary age through to about 15, 16. Now, it was quite remarkable that these students, and this is a cultural point, I think, these students had memorized a 20-minute program at the age of 10, 11. They were playing music that our teenagers would find, 5 years, 6 years older than, would find very challenging. And I asked them, how do you memorize it? This music is really hard. How do you play it? They said, well, 1 month before this competition, we've met for at least 1 hour a day, every single day. So if you unpack that, that means their parents have taken them every single day for 30 days without fail to a rehearsal. They drop them off, they're playing, and then they leave. And I witnessed 1 or 2 things where a kid would play a wrong note or thing, and they would be roasted by their conductor. I mean, it was quite uncomfortable to watch. But culturally, that would never happen in this country. You just simply would not get that sort of commitment, because the value of what they're doing is not shared at a parental level across the board. It's just not there. It would be obscene for us to say that. It would be difficult to get that sort of commitment a month before a national competition. But there, it's very standard. If you're going to do this, you're going to do it really, really well. And we expect you to do it really well, because culturally, that's what they expect of their children. And the results are absolutely remarkable.
No, that makes sense. Especially with the whole, it also depends on the parents' level of understanding of how willing they want to learn music. And I guess I kind of I'm seeing myself, it was hard to convince my family that I wanted to do music, but now like it's I guess that's how it's different in different cultures, how in like places like such as Korea and America, or parts of America, it's seen as like essential, it's seen as it's important, it's part of your growth, but in other places, such as in UK, there are other subjects where it's seen there's more value, such as English and maths. So it does really vary.
Absolutely, it does. It does, and I'm not going to knock the education system in this country, because there's much for merits, but and there's much to question about how the American system works, and the breadth of knowledge they have or don't have. So it's you know, and we do have a very, very firm learn your maths and your English and your geography and your history, and learn these well. And then in addition, if you are thriving at those, then also you might consider taking on other subjects which you can study. It's very much that way around. It's very much kind of one block of importance, other things you can do. Where in America, it's much more, here are all the things that we can offer you. What would you like to do? Okay, if you want to do music, great. If you want to do sport and you have no time for music, great. Go and join the sports team, brilliant. But don't forget, if you join the sports team, we meet 5 days a week. So you've got to be there for 2 hours after school. And if you don't meet that, then you're not in the team. And there's that commitment again. There's that approach, and that's the amount of time you commit. But the students have got that time to do it. So it's a very, very different approach. And I, you know, you can argue pros and cons for both, of course.
Fair enough. Okay, so that was all the questions I have for you. So thank you again for doing this interview with me. I've got more facts I can feed back on. It's quite nice to just learn about these different types of like how jazz can be influenced in other classical and jazz can be influenced in other countries, how important it is, and how it's not really like what I've learned a lot throughout this year is that it's really not all about Bristol. Even though Bristol was considerably the most musical city in UK, that time has long passed now. It's really wide range. You can't really specify Bristol, and it's quite interesting to know. So thank you once again, and this will be the